The Regulation D rule set has completely changed what competitive Pokemon VGC looks like, and today at Beastcoast Pokemon, I am here to break down what you should expect to see in the early days of the metagame. Before we get started though, thank you so much as always for joining me. My name is Aaron Cybertron Zhang, and here at Beastcoast Pokemon, we do all kinds of competitive Pokemon content. Thanks for joining me, and let's just dive into things. In terms of brand new Pokemon, Urshifu is definitely one of the first Pokemon to talk about. Now, Urshifu previously in Sword and Shield was already really good, and in Sword and Shield, we had Dynamax as a thing. Without Dynamax now, Urshifu feels even stronger, of course, because you can't just double a Pokemon's HP. So, Water Urshifu right now feels like the more dominant one. I've seen it a lot more than Dark Urshifu, but I think both are incredibly viable. The main thing about Water Urshifu is that it pairs really nicely with Tornadus. That's actually probably one of the most common combinations that I've seen so far in the format. And of course, the idea is that Tornadus can set up Tailwind for Urshifu and even set up Rain Dance, and Urshifu can just do so much damage through Surging Strikes. Most Urshifus I've seen are something like Focus Sash, Choice Band, Mystic Water. Mystic Water, I think I've actually seen the most, but all of those items are obviously really viable. Scarf, you can run U-Turn, for example, to pivot out and then use it as a late game sweeper as well. That allows you to, say, outspeed Flutter Mane and get a knockout. So Urshifu is definitely one Pokemon to pay attention to. It's fairly straightforward in how you run it. There's nothing too crazy about it, but it is just incredibly powerful. I mentioned Tornadus early as a partner for it, and Tornadus is easily one of the best Pokemon in the format right now. You think about Scarlet and Violet, now Terra exists, so you can go Ghost Terra to avoid a potential fake out, or you can put a Covert Cloak onto Tornadus to avoid flinches, or for example avoid Electro Web speed drops from something like Regieleki. Tornadus just is a really consistent Tailwind user, and it enables so many different Pokemon in this format. It also gets access to a lot of utility. Obviously you have Tailwind and Taunt, but you also of course get access to all the different weathers which you can set up manually. So Rain Dance, Sunny Day, really nice. For example, Sunny Day you can set it up for Flutter Mane, Rain Dance you can set up for Basculegion, and so I think Tornadus is just one of the best Pokemon, and it should be heavily considered if you're looking for good speed control thanks to access to Tailwind. The next couple of Pokemon really shouldn't be surprising either. Honestly, most of the things in this set are Pokemon that we've seen had very good success in previous years of VGC. Heatran right now is really solid as well. I've seen different items run on this. Leftovers is used, Assault Vest is used. I've even seen choice items, for example, or the damage reducing items. The idea is that Heatran is just a pretty bulky Pokemon. Of course, in previous generations, you had to get around its weaknesses by burrowing a type resistance berry, but now you can Terra to get around it. So I've seen a lot of Grass Terra Heatrans in particular, and you'll generally run a combination of moves like Heat Wave, Earth Power, maybe Terra Blast, for example, Protect. I think the thing about Heatran also is that you can use Heavy Slam on it to get a one-hit knockout onto Flutter Mane, which is a cool tech. Flutter Mane, as I'll talk about in a little bit, is still everywhere in this format. Heatran, of course, has a really nice resistance to Fairy, and by going for a Terra, you don't necessarily still stay weak to ground and water type attacks. The next one to talk about is Rillaboom. Now, Rillaboom is pretty interesting because it lost a lot of really good moves after Sword and Shield. For example, it used to have Grassy Glide, it used to have High Horsepower, now it doesn't get either of those. That being said, it's still a pretty solid Pokemon. It is a decently fast fake out user with a really good attack stat. Grass typing in general is just pretty valuable. You can switch into a lot of things like water type attacks, for example, and Rillaboom still does a lot of damage with Wood Hammer. You can also, of course, U-turn and knock off with it as well. So most Rillaboom sets I've seen are Assault Vested, kind of like what we saw in the previous generation, but you can run Miracle Seed, you can run Choice Band, Citrus Berry, for example. Setting up grassy terrain can be nice for recovery as well, especially on teams that want to have bulkier Pokemon that stay on the field for a long period of time. I think one thing that I've noted is that Leftovers has felt really good in VGC this year, maybe more so than most years, and Rillaboom, Grassy Terrain combined with Leftovers, of course, can be especially nice in particular. Landorus Therian, of course, returns to this format as well. It's an interesting one where I think it might not be as strong as some of the previous years it was legal in, like 2013 or 15, but it still is, of course, really good. It's a solid Intimidator. I think one thing that makes Landorus maybe a little bit weaker is Clear Amulet existing as an item, but you know, we had a lot of Intimidate in Series 1, Series 2, Regulation C, and Clear Amulet still wasn't used that much, and Intimidate was everywhere. With Landorus, it's very much like the older generations of VGC where there's so many different items that are viable on it. You can run Assault Vest, I've seen a lot of that in particular, but you can run a choice item like Choice Band or Choice Scarf. You can run, for example, I've even seen Rocky Helmet. Rocky Helmet's really interesting because, of course, Water Urshifu is everywhere right now, as I mentioned earlier. But if you have a defensive Terra with Landorus and Rocky Helmet, you can actually just make Urshifu take so much damage by itself, which I think is kind of a funny solution. evolution, but that's one item in particular that I've seen rise a lot in usage just because Water Urshifu is everywhere right now. Now, of course, when we talk about Landorus, we also have to highlight Thundurus. Thundurus is still very solid. It's very much like how people ran Thundurus in previous generations, the bulky prankster support set. Of course, you get access to Thunder Wave, you get access to Taunt. The genies all get a new signature move, which are not 100% accurate unless the rain is up, but it hits both of the opponents and has a chance of a secondary effect as well. So with Thundurus, you can deal decent damage, and you of course can disrupt your opponent with Thunder Wave with Taunt. And it also of course gets access to moves like Scary Face and Eerie Impulse. So kind of the support Thunduruses that we saw in Sword and Shield fulfills a very similar role. Finally, to round things out, we've got Cresselia, which of course is a huge VGC staple. I think Cresselia's introduction to the format makes it one of the best Trick Room users. Trick Room actually wasn't that common throughout Series 1, Series 2, or Regulation C. And I think one of the issues with Trick Room in general is after I set up Trick Room, what do I do with a Pokemon that set up Trick Room? For example, Indeedee is a really good Pokemon to set up Trick Room with, but it's relatively passive and doesn't really do very much damage. Cresselia is really nice because it can set up Trick Room, it can deal decent damage through moves like Psychic and Ice Beam and Moonblast, but it can also heal its partner and Cresselia itself through a brand new signature move in Lunar Blessing, which is awesome as well. So the main thing about Cresselia is obviously you are going to be weak to some common typings, Flutter Mane Shadow Ball, Dark Urshifu's Wicked Blow, but Cresselia is so bulky that you can often tank one attack, so your opponents will often have to double up into it to get a knockout. Common items include Mentorb. I've seen that the most by far so far, but of course recovery items like Leftovers or Citrus Berry or one of the bulkier berries are all really viable. Safety Goggles also quite nice, so you can just completely wall Moongus while also dealing super effective damage into it. I think in terms of new Pokemon, as in Pokemon from the Hisuian region, there are a couple that have caught my eye. Ursaluna is one that everyone talked about in the beginning of the format, and what's interesting about Ursaluna is that I think players have realized this Pokemon is really good, but it's not that easy to actually use. For example, Cresselia plus Ursaluna is one of the natural duos that people started using in the beginning of the format. The problem with that is Ursaluna right now, a lot of players like to run Flame Orb on it, and you'll use a moveset like Facade, Earthquake, Headlong Rush, maybe Crunch, for example, and Protect. But the problem is that it takes a turn for the Flame Orb to activate. So if you lead something like Cresselia plus Ursaluna, you often feel compelled to protect Ursaluna to get the Flame Orb activated, and that leaves Cresselia vulnerable to just eating up 2 attacks and fainting immediately. And if that happens, you're just so far behind in the game. Ursaluna as a Pokemon I think has immense potential, but I think right now most people are just defaulting to the Flame Orb Gut set, which is obviously really strong. A lot of people are opting for just like triple attack plus protect as well. I think this Pokemon has a lot of potential because it gets access to Swords Dance, it gets access to Belly Drum. So I think that this Pokemon is one I have my eye out on, in the sense that I think as time develops, it may continue to actually get better, because right now the way people are using it can be a little bit one-dimensional and sometimes left vulnerable, but definitely one to pay attention to. Basculegion is also another really interesting one that I've seen a lot of Japanese players use in particular. The idea behind it, of course, is that with the rain, you can just outspeed things thanks to Swift Swim, and you do so much damage with Wave Crash and Last Respects. Last Respects obviously being an incredible Pokemon or move to close out games with. And so yeah, I think most Basculegions are run how you'd expect them to be run. You use something like a Life Orb, maybe a Choice Band, maybe Mystic Water, but the idea is to just do massive amounts of damage with it to clean up the game, and it pairs really nicely with Rain, so Pelipper can set up the Rain for it. Tornadus can also manually Rain Dance and set up the Rain for it. Hisuian Goodra is an interesting one. I think I've talked to some players and they're like, this Pokemon is kind of overrated. I don't get why people are using it so much. The main thing about it is that it's really bulky and difficult to KO, and it can increase its defense very rapidly through Shelter, which is a signature move. The thing about Hisuian Goodra is that it stays on the field for a really long time. I think some players like to just throw it onto a team because of its ability, Shell Armor, or one of its abilities, I should say, and that of course prevents critical hits. And so with Urshifu being so common, being able to avoid those crits and not take very much damage is really nice. With Hisuian Goodra, you'll often see Shelter, Body Press, Heavy Slam, and Protect. Heavy Slam is obviously really good for the Flutter Mane in particular. I think one of the main thing about Hisuian Goodra is that sometimes it just stays on the field for a long time, but also maybe doesn't do very much against opposing teams, especially if they have a ghost type Pokemon, because you can't hit them with Heavy Slam, or sorry, with Body Press, right? And so that's one thing to pay attention to. But the thing is, Hisuian Goodra can be really annoying. I do think there are a fair amount of teams that just like don't really have any reliable answers for it. It can just kind of 1v4 an entire team. So it's certainly a Pokemon you should still show respect to. I've seen it paired with like Grimmsnarl and Rillaboom. Grimmsnarl to set up screens for it, and then Rillaboom to set up grassy terrain for it in particular. Hisuian Zoroark, I think, is also a Pokemon that's really interesting to me because it is able to obviously disguise itself as something else, and with its normal ghost typing, you are immune to some really key offensive typings. This is a Pokemon I'm really interested in personally. I thought Zoroark was always kind of underplayed in previous generations of VGC, and the main reason for it being underplayed is because it's really hard to come up with strategies around it, but I wonder what potential Hisuian Zoroark has, especially with the stronger typing and with Dondozo Tatsugiri, for example, still being a thing. And so that's a Pokemon that I'm curious about. So far, I've seen a lot of people use Focus Sash variants, and you just run a lot of different offensive attacks like Hyper Voice, for example, and the idea is to just lead it, deal some good damage with it. Maybe you can clean up games with it, but I think to maximize its ability, leading with it is often a strong option. And then the final brand new Pokemon that I've seen a decent amount of is Sneasler. I've seen a lot of Japanese players use Rillaboom and Sneasler in particular. The idea is to set up the grassy terrain for Sneasler. Sneasler is a grassy seed, so it eats up the seed. It has Unburden, so it just outspeeds practically everything. And you can do a lot of damage with moves like Acrobatics, as well as Sneasler's signature attack. A lot of Sneaslers are going to go Flying Terra as well, so the idea is you lead Rillaboom Sneasler, and suddenly you just have Rillaboom with Fake Out Pressure, and Sneasler can just start dealing large amounts of damage while outspeeding so many different Pokemon as well. So it's a pretty offensive duo. In terms of old Pokemon that we have previously played with in Regulation 1, 2, or Series 1, 2, and Regulation C, I think the main ones that jump out right now to me are Chien-Pao. Chien-Pao hyper offense is everywhere right now. Chien-Pao Dragonite was obviously really good in Regulation C, won a regional championship, and it's still really, really good here in Regulation D. And you think about it, right? Some of those new Pokemon I just mentioned, a lot of those are physical Pokemon. Urshifu loves to get that defense drop from Chien-Pao. Rillaboom loves that as well. And Tornadus can set up Tailwind for this new combo as well. And so the idea is that Chien-Pao just does so much damage, especially with how offensive the early format seems to be. I think the one thing you can consider is maybe putting on a dark type attack, let's not Sucker Punch, to deal with Cresselia more if Cresselia usage rises, for example. Because against Cresselia can obviously just like set up Trick Room and ignore Sucker Punch, but that's one thing to pay attention to. Flutter Mane continues to be everywhere. This was the most used Pokemon in Regulation C, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. What's interesting is in Regulation D, there are more Pokemon that can handle it, especially with Assault Vest. Like Assault Vest Heatran, Assault Vest Rillaboom, Assault Vest Landorus T, all of those can like take attacks pretty well, but Flutter Mane is still just really darn good and can slot into what feels like almost every team, right? And so the sets that we saw in Regulation C, the choice sets, for example, as well as the booster energy sets, continue to be quite powerful. I think Gholdengo in particular has felt a little bit stronger returning to this format, especially because something like Tornadus just really can't do very much into it. And so the interesting thing about Gholdengo is at the end of Regulation C, we saw different sets, Leftovers, Terra Water, Nasty Plot, as well as choice specs. I think both of those continue to be quite viable in this format. And all of the other Pokemon I listed are just big staples, right? A Moongus, super bulky. What's interesting is that taunt usage, I feel like, has gone up a little bit now that Tornadus and Thundurus exist. So like Mentor might be a stronger item going into the future, depending on how the metagame shakes up. Now let's quickly highlight some combinations to look out for. In terms of strategies and duos that you should be aware of, the first thing to call out is Tailwind Hyper Offense. This has already existed in Regulation C. Previously, people were using things like Talonflame, Garchomp, Chien-Pao, Dragonite, but now you get Tornadus and Urshifu to the mix. Tornadus and Rapid Strike Urshifu in general is just a really strong combination. That's one thing you should prepare for, especially as a lead duo, but you can also obviously pair it with Chien-Pao, Dragonite, Flutter Mane, throw in a 6 Pokemon, and boom, you've already got a solid Hyper Offense team. The main thing is that it's really easy for Tornadus to set up Tailwind now, especially thanks to Ghost Terra and Covert Cloak, and so it can be a little bit difficult to fight against, and there's just so much offense in this format. Now on the opposite end, Trick Room obviously is also interesting, especially with Cresselia being introduced to the format. I think the main thing about Trick Room is that, you know, like a lot of Trick Room teams, you might not want to just go full Trick Room. You have a Trick Room mode with like Cresselia, maybe like a sweeper such as Ursaluna, but you don't necessarily only want to rely on slow Pokemon. Hard Trick Room had actually seen a good amount of success throughout Scarlet and Violet, but it wasn't used that frequently. It was more like a couple players were able to pilot it to very good success. I think Trick Room is really viable. I expect it to be strong in this format. I always thought it was a little bit underplayed in the previous formats, and it's funny, we ended up seeing like Trick Room Flutter Mane pop up towards the end of Regulation C. But yeah, I think Trick Room is viable, and if you think about when all of these Pokemon were legal in other formats, Cresselia with Trick Room was always really solid. Now, there are also new duels to pay attention to, and I kind of highlighted them previously, but just to summarize, Rillaboom plus Sneasler is one that I've seen a lot of. I've also seen seen Grimmsnarl plus Hisuian Goodra. I've also seen Basculegion plus Rain, whether it be from Pelipper or Tornadus, for example. The thing about these duos is when it's the start of a new format, people kind of want to just try to figure out how to make these new Pokemon work. Obviously, with most of the Pokemon coming in Regulation D, we've actually used them in VGC and other games and generations, but the Hisuian Pokemon are completely new, so it makes sense for people to gravitate towards trying out something and just seeing how can I make these Pokemon work. I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere down the road, Sneasler doesn't end up being solely used next to Rillaboom. For now, most people are doing that, for example. And Basculegion, you don't necessarily have to use Swift Swim. It does get adaptability as an ability as well. I think people are just defaulting to these modes because it's easy to build around and it's naturally what you think about. So those are all things to pay attention to as well. One thing I'm particularly curious about is kind of like the O duels that we saw, right? Mouse Hold plus Annihilate. Haven't really seen that too much in the Regulation D games I played, as well as Dondozo. Dondozo, I feel like people keep writing off from like Regulation Series 2 to Regulation C. I think people are like, oh, you know, Dondozo is going to fall off, and then it still has gotten like top 8 at every tournament, right? And so it's certainly still a strategy you need to show a lot of respect to. I actually haven't seen Dondozo used very much at all, so I wonder if that's actually a little bit underplayed right now, and it's certainly something I would still want to show respect to. Some of the old duos, I think people aren't using as much, but I'm not sure if that's because they're just objectively a lot weaker or because people want to focus on trying out these new tools first before combining all of it. That's going to be it for a quick Regulation D preview. Hopefully this was helpful in terms of just listing Pokemon to expect, as well as common strategies and compositions. And the brand new start of a format is really chaotic. Really anything can work. And so I encourage you to just try out Pokemon and strategies that excite you rather than trying to build towards a meta, because there really isn't that much of a meta right now. That being said, those Pokemon that I listed in the beginning of this video, you definitely should at least pay attention to and show them respect, because you are going to see those more frequently than other Pokemon. Thank you so much as always for joining me. We just surpassed 20,000 subscribers, which means a lot, and there are so many people that work behind the scenes tirelessly to make these videos happen. So thanks for being a part of this journey. We have so many big plans in store for the upcoming weeks and months, and we hope you can be a part of it as well. So my name is Aaron Cybertron Zhang. This is Beastcoast Pokemon. We hope you enjoyed. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel. Let us know down in the comment section below what you would like to see and what Pokemon and strategies you think will be good in Regulation D, and we'll see you all soon. All right, peace.